Hello.
It hit me like a ton of bricks. One phone call, just one simple sentence, and suddenly everything I thought I'd moved past came rushing back with a force that left me reeling. I was standing on my balcony, looking out at the city skyline in the distance when I heard my ex-husband's voice cut through the silence. It was cold, flat, yet decisive. "I'm getting married again." My fingers clenched around the railing, the cold metal pressing into my palms, grounding me in the moment. The air felt heavy, suffocating even, as though the universe was pushing down on me with the weight of his words. My initial response was silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My heart didn't race like I'd expected. Instead, there was nothing. A complete emptiness where the pain should have been. And that terrified me more than any tears ever could. "Did you hear me?" he asked, his voice crackling with uncertainty as he tried to gauge my reaction to the silence. "I heard you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. A long pause followed, long enough for me to hear my own breathing, long enough to realize how completely detached I was from the conversation, from him, from the man who had once held my heart. Below me, the city hummed on, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "Okay then," he said. "I just thought you should know." Before I could say another word, the call ended. Just like that, he was gone, and I was left standing there, gripping the cold metal of the balcony. My knuckles were white, but I still didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Anger? Sadness? Jealousy? Instead, I felt a crushing sense of disconnection, like the whole world had drifted further from me. The city noises, honking horns, distant conversations, seemed muffled, like they were coming from miles away. I turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me with a snap that broke the silence. My apartment greeted me just as it always had, empty, dim, and different. Same furniture, same muted colors, same cold atmosphere. It felt like time had stopped the moment my marriage ended, as if nothing had changed since the divorce. No new decorations, no burst of color. I hadn't let myself move forward, hadn't allowed myself to grow. The apartment was a mirror of my life, stale, suspended in emotional limbo. Without thinking, I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a glass of wine. It was a habit now, one glass then another. Enough to blur the sharp edges of reality, but not enough to numb me entirely. As I sipped the cool liquid sliding down my throat, I wondered if this was all life would be from now on. A never-ending cycle of distant moments and empty sips. But his words, "I'm getting married again," kept circling in my mind, refusing to fade. They should have hurt, should have cut me open, but they didn't. Instead, they just hung there, heavy and hollow. I wasn't in love with him anymore. I hadn't been for years. That part was done. But the reminder of what we once had, of the future we'd envisioned, that was harder to swallow. I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window, the faint glow of city lights casting shadows on my face. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were dull, tired. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and her posture was slumped, as though the weight of all those years had finally caught up with her. Who was she now? A woman in her 40s, lost in a life that had passed her by, with no dreams or direction, just existing while the world carried on without her. I took another sip of wine, the bitterness settling in my chest. How had I ended up like this? When did I become so invisible in my own life? And why did it still hurt to hear that he was moving on? The wineglass trembled in my hand, so I set it down on the counter, staring at the swirling red liquid. The sadness crept in, as familiar as an old friend, its cold fingers wrapping around my chest. But even that sadness felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I was just an observer, watching as everything slipped away. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes, wishing I could feel something, anything, to remind myself I was still here. But nothing came. Just the same emptiness that had been my constant companion since the divorce. How had I let it get this bad? Outside, the rain started falling softly, tapping against the windows like a gentle reminder of the world beyond my apartment. I pushed the balcony door open and let the cool air rush in. The city lights blurred behind a curtain of rain. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting the drops hit my face, trying to wash away the numbness. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the cold rain snapped me back to reality. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and the silence of the apartment enveloped me once again. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The events of the evening replayed in my mind. He was getting married again. The man who had once been my everything was moving on, starting a new chapter with someone else. And I was still stuck, trapped in the same place, living out the same empty routine. I didn't know how to move on, how to rebuild. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. I didn't remember exactly when I started taking those walks, but they had become a nightly ritual. After work, I'd leave my apartment and wander through the city aimlessly, just moving for the sake of moving. There was something oddly comforting about walking through the busy streets, watching the sea of anonymous faces rush by. It made me feel less isolated in my own emptiness. That evening was no different. I slipped out of the office just as the sun began to dip, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The streets were already teeming with people heading home, their heads down as they rushed past, too focused to notice each other. I blended in effortlessly, just another faceless figure in the city's fast-moving current. The air was cool, with a light breeze stirring the leaves in the trees lining the street. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, seeking some protection from the chill. My feet led me instinctively toward the river, where the city's pace seemed to slow just a bit near the water. The frantic energy of the city faded into the background, replaced by the soft sound of waves lapping against the shore. As I neared my usual spot by the water, I saw him. He was sitting on a bench with his back to the river, legs stretched out in front of him. A book was open in his hands, and he seemed completely absorbed, oblivious to everything else around him. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him there. He'd been in that same spot a few nights ago, always with that same book, always with that same quiet focus. At first, I hadn't thought much of him. Just another stranger in the crowd, another person lost in their own world. But tonight, something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was the calm stillness he exuded while the rest of the city raced by. Or maybe it was just the way he seemed to belong there, in that quiet corner of the city, while everyone else seemed out of place. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to keep walking or stop. Before I could decide, he looked up. Our eyes met, and for a brief instant the world around us seemed to freeze. His gaze was steady, curious but not intrusive, like he could see past the walls I'd built around myself. I quickly averted my eyes, heat rising in my cheeks, embarrassed by the moment. What was I doing? I didn't know him. There was no reason to be staring at him. But something about that look, the way his eyes lingered on me just a little longer than they should have, made it hard to shake the feeling that this moment meant something. I walked past him, my heart suddenly racing. The river stretched out ahead, shimmering in the dying light, but I barely noticed it. All I could think about was that look, that fleeting connection with a stranger. It wasn't the first time I'd been curious about someone, but it was the first time in years that it felt like more than a passing thought. As I continued walking, I couldn't resist glancing back. He was still there, sitting on the bench, his eyes now back on his book as though nothing had happened. For a second I wondered if I should turn around, say something, anything, just to break the silence that had settled between us. But I kept walking, and the rest of the evening passed in a blur. I found myself walking farther than usual, my mind preoccupied with the man on the bench. Something about the way he looked at me stirred feelings I thought I'd long buried. By the time I returned to my apartment, the sun had set, and the city was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. I unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar dimness of my living room. The silence welcomed me, wrapping itself around me as I kicked off my shoes and sank onto the couch. My eyes wandered to the city below as my thoughts kept returning to that brief moment by the river. What was it about him that I couldn't shake? He was just a stranger, someone I didn't know, and probably never would. But there was a part of me that felt like that moment had shifted something. Like a crack had formed in the emotional wall I'd spent so long building. I reached for the glass of wine I'd left on the coffee table, swirling the red liquid around as I tried to sort through my thoughts. It was ridiculous, I told myself. I didn't even know his name. And yet, here I was sitting alone in my apartment, thinking about him as if he were more than just a passing figure in my day. But the thought wouldn't leave me. A part of me, one I didn't fully understand, wanted to see him again, to feel that strange connection once more, to figure out what that brief exchange of glances had meant. I set the glass down with a deep sigh and leaned back against the cushions. It was foolish, I knew that. But in a life that had become so monotonous, so predictable, Even something as small as that moment felt like a spark. And maybe, just maybe, that spark was enough to pull me out of the numbness that had held me for so long. A few days had passed since that encounter by the river, but I couldn't stop thinking about him as I walked the same route home from work. I found myself scanning the crowd, hoping, though I wouldn't admit it, to catch another glimpse of the man with the book. But each day passed in a dull blur, and he was nowhere to be found. I told myself to let it go, that it was silly to obsess over a fleeting moment with someone whose name I didn't even know. And yet, the pull I felt toward him only seemed to grow stronger. The memory of that silent connection lingered, haunting me in the back of my mind. I had no reason to feel this way. It didn't make sense. But after everything I'd been through, logic wasn't something I could rely on. That evening, I decided to change my route home. The crowded streets, the endless sea of unfamiliar faces, the suffocating monotony. It all felt too much. So instead of walking by the river, I headed toward the subway station. Maybe the change of scenery would help clear my head. The city had a way of swallowing you up, and I needed to feel like I had some control, even if it was just for a moment. The platform was packed like always, with people shifting impatiently, waiting for the next train. I squeezed my way to the edge, trying to keep some distance from the crowd, and stared down the tunnel, listening to the approaching rumble of the subway. When the train screeched to a stop, the door slid open with a hiss. I stepped inside and found a spot by the window, away from the mass of bodies. It was then that I saw him. He was standing a few feet away, casually leaning against the opposite door. His gaze was fixed on something beyond the glass. It wasn't until the train jolted to life that I dared to glance his way, and instantly my heart skipped. There he was, the man. The stranger from the bench, the one who had haunted my thoughts for days, now standing so close in the crowded subway car. I froze. What was I supposed to do now? Should I say something? Would he even remember me? My mind raced in 1,000 directions, but before I could settle on a response, he looked up. Our eyes locked for the second time. That same quiet intensity, the same pull between us that had been there by the river. This time his lips curled into the faintest of smiles. The rush of warmth that spread through me made my heart race faster. His gaze, calm and steady, made everything else disappear. The city, the noise, the motion, the crowded car. In that brief moment, it felt as though it was just the two of us suspended outside time. I quickly looked away, embarrassed by how flustered I was. This was insane. What was I doing? He was a complete stranger. But even then, I could feel his presence, his eyes on me, as though the space between us had already started to shrink. As the train halted at the next station, some passengers filed out, leaving the car quieter. I stole another look in his direction, and to my surprise, he was already walking toward me. My breath caught. He stopped just a couple of feet away, his gaze never breaking. "You were by the river the other night," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. I nodded, unable to speak, the unexpectedness of the moment leaving me frozen. His presence was disarming, pulling me in, making me feel both electrified and off balance. "I thought I recognized you," he added, his eyes scanning my face as though searching for something. "I didn't expect to see you again." His words hit me like a wave. I had convinced myself our brief encounter had meant nothing, that I was imagining things. But hearing him say it, that he'd thought about it too, made my heart race all over again. "I didn't expect it either," I finally managed, my voice a near whisper, barely audible above the noise of the train. There was a pause, a long stretch of silence between us, filled with the weight of something unsaid. The air around us seemed to thicken as if the whole world had stopped moving just for that moment. The train lurched forward again, and suddenly everything shifted. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. Without thinking, he leaned in, and before I could comprehend what was happening, his lips pressed against mine in a brief, electrifying kiss. It was soft, a fleeting contact, but it felt like it lasted an eternity. Unexpected, but not unwelcome, as though it had been building since that first moment on the riverbank. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a rush of emotions, surprise, desire, even fear. But before I could process any of them, it was over. We pulled apart, and the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. We stood there, both silent, our eyes locked for a few seconds longer. The world around us continued, but in that moment it felt like we were the only two people on the train. I could still feel the warmth of his lips on mine, the electric jolt of that contact still rippling through me. I didn't know what to make of it or what it meant, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random interaction. This wasn't the end. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty, a tinge of apology. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm despite the whirlwind inside me. "Don't apologize." The train slowed as it approached the next stop, and I briefly wondered if he would just leave. Would this be all there was? But instead of stepping off, he stayed, his eyes still on mine, like he was waiting for something. For me to make a choice, to decide where this would go next. The doors slid open with a hiss, and the crowd moved in and out, but neither of us moved. The doors closed again, and the train lurched forward, the lights outside flashing by. But I couldn't tear my focus away from him. He was standing so close that the air around us felt charged, like it was humming with an energy I couldn't quite grasp. The silence between us was thick, filled with all the things we hadn't said, the space between us crackling with possibility. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what I wanted from this moment from him. But somehow I knew walking away wasn't an option anymore. Something had changed between us and I couldn't ignore it. He didn't look away. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, steady and patient, as if he was waiting for me to make the next move. There was something about the way he watched me, intense, unblinking, that made my heart race and my thoughts scatter. I didn't know who he was. Not really. And yet here I was standing inches away from him, my pulse hammering in a way I hadn't felt in years. I looked down at my hands, gripping the strap of my bag tightly, trying to steady my breath. The truth was I was scared. Scared of what this might mean. Scared of what I was feeling. Scared of where this was going. For so long I'd shut myself off from connections, built walls around me, and now in the face of something real I had no idea how to let someone in. The train jerked again, speeding through another tunnel. I lost my balance for a second, and instinctively reached for the pull above me. At the same time his hand shot out, catching mine and steadying me. The touch sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, breath caught in my throat. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to say anything else. His hand on mine grounded me, but it also made everything more intense. More real. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. I found myself holding on to that moment, the warmth of his touch, the electricity that buzzed between us. As the train began to slow, approaching the next station, an unexpected clarity washed over me. I didn't want this to end. I didn't want to step off the train, leaving all of this behind and walking back into my life as though nothing had changed. I had no idea where this was going or what it could lead to. But for the first time in years I felt alive. Truly, unmistakably alive. The doors opened and a rush of cool air from the platform broke the spell. He released my hand, and I immediately felt the loss, like a connection had been severed. People shuffled past us, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Neither of us moved. The doors closed again, and the train pulled away, leaving us in that strange suspended space, where time seemed to stretch. I didn't know what was coming next or what I was supposed to do. But one thing was certain. I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and barely audible over the hum of the train. "Do you want to get off at the next stop? Maybe grab a coffee or something?" It was such a simple question, yet it held so much more. This wasn't about coffee. It was about deciding whether I was ready to take a step into the unknown, to lower my guard, to let something new and unpredictable into my life. I hesitated for just a moment before nodding. He led me to a small, tucked-away coffee shop, a quiet refuge from the bustling streets. The place felt timeless, with its worn wooden tables and soft lighting that bathed everything in a warm amber glow. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside meeting the cool evening air, creating an intimate atmosphere, as if the world outside had faded away. We sat at a table in the back, away from the few other customers scattered around. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened. The kiss, the subway, the tension that still lingered in the air, and now the uncertainty of what would come next. I watched as he took a sip of his coffee, his eyes flickering toward mine with that same intensity that had first pulled me in. My heart raced, caught between excitement and fear. This wasn't what I had planned, but then again, nothing about this had been planned. Somehow I had let myself get caught up in something that felt bigger than me. And yet here I was sitting across from him, feeling more alive than I had in years. We started talking, our words tentative at first, as though we were both feeling our way through the space between us. He told me about his life, his work, his love for books, the city where he had grown up. His voice was calm, steady, and as he spoke, I found myself drawn not just to his words, but to the way he carried himself. There was a quiet confidence about him, something reassuring yet unpredictable in the way his gaze lingered on me. It was as if I was standing on the edge of something thrilling and dangerous at the same time. As the evening wore on, our conversation grew more fluid, the tension between us shifting into something else, something softer but no less intense. At times we would fall silent, and in those quiet moments, I could feel the electricity building between us once more. Every glance, every subtle movement, felt like a question waiting for an answer. At some point I noticed the coffee shop had grown quieter. The few remaining customers had gathered their things and were preparing to leave, and the barista was cleaning up behind the counter. I glanced at the clock. "We should probably go," I said softly, though part of me didn't want the night to end. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't quite ready for it to end either. We stood up, gathered our things, and stepped out into the cool night air. The reality of what had just happened hit me all over again. The kiss, the connection that I couldn't shake, the fact that I was standing here with someone who just days ago had been a complete stranger. The streets were almost empty, the city quiet except for the occasional car passing by. I turned to face him, unsure of what to say next. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I knew this was moving too fast, but at the same time I didn't want to stop it. The logical part of me screamed to slow down, to walk away before things got too complicated. But my heart wasn't listening. Without a word, he stepped closer, and the air between us crackled, just like it had on the subway. Before I could even think about it, he leaned in again. This kiss wasn't hesitant or fleeting. It was deep, filled with everything that had been building between us. Desire, curiosity, and something I couldn't quite name. When we finally pulled apart, the world seemed to settle back into place, but inside, everything was still spinning. I took a step back, breath shaky, trying to gather my thoughts. This was real. It was happening, and I had no idea where it would lead. He looked at me, his voice low and steady. "I don't want to rush this," he said. "But there's something here, isn't there?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. There was something undeniable between us, and it terrified me. I'd spent so long avoiding anything that made me vulnerable, and now standing on the edge of something so unexpected, I wasn't sure if I was ready to dive in. "I don't know what this is," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But yes, there is." The admission felt freeing and terrifying all at once. I was acknowledging something I had tried to ignore, and now there was no turning back. The next few days passed in a blur. He was in my thoughts constantly. The way he looked at me, the way that kiss hung between us like an unspoken promise. It felt like everything had changed. Something inside me had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't tell if it was for the better or worse. I had always kept my distance, refusing to let anyone in, convinced that protecting myself was the only way to avoid pain. But now, without warning, I had allowed myself to open up to something that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. With that rush of excitement came a gnawing sense of doubt. What was I doing? I barely knew him. For so long, I had carefully guarded myself from vulnerability, convinced that love would only bring heartache. And now here I was, standing on the precipice of something that seemed too good to be real. My mind screamed at me to back off, to pull away before it was too late. But my heart had already taken its own path. The connection between us was undeniable, even if I couldn't quite understand it. I found myself wondering how I had ended up here, so caught up in something that had started without warning. We met again the following weekend, this time in a quiet park on the edge of the city. The air had a bite to it, the first hints of winter creeping in, but the cold didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he looked at me when I arrived, standing there with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, waiting patiently. We walked side by side through the park, the trees stripped of their leaves, the ground littered with the last remnants of fall. The conversation flowed easily enough, But there was an undercurrent of tension, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the other to make the next move. Neither of us seemed willing to take the first step, as if we were both unsure where this was heading and afraid to be the one to decide. When we reached a small clearing, we stopped. The silence between us felt heavier now, as if it had grown too thick to ignore. He turned to face me, his expression serious, as if he had already made up his mind about something important. "I don't want to mess this up," he said quietly, his words barely audible. "But I need to know. Where do you see this going?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the one thing I had been avoiding, the one thing I wasn't ready to answer. I turned away, looking out at the empty trees, trying to gather my thoughts. Where did I see this going? I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. I'd been too caught up in the here and now, in the way he made me feel, in the way we clicked. But now he was asking, and I didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't expecting any of this. I wasn't looking for it." He nodded slowly, his face unreadable. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted more. He was waiting for me to give him something concrete, something real to hold on to. But I didn't have it. I wasn't ready to give him that reassurance. As much as I wanted to dive in, to let myself fall, I was still holding back. I was afraid of what would happen if I let myself fall too hard. "I don't want to rush you," he said gently, though I could hear the edge of frustration in his tone. "But I need to know if this is real for you. Because it is for me." His words stung, but in a way that made me feel both exposed and vulnerable. He was laying everything out there, offering me something I hadn't expected. But I wasn't sure I could offer him the same in return. I felt a knot form in my chest. He was taking a risk, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take it with him. I hesitated, my breath catching. "I don't want to get hurt again." It was the truth, the rawest kind of truth I'd been avoiding. I was terrified. Terrified of falling too hard, of letting my guard down, only to have it all crash around me. Terrified of trusting someone again. He took a step closer, his gaze steady as he searched mine. "I'm not him," he said softly, his words cutting through me. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a moment I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let go of my fears, to trust that this could be different. That he was different. But the wounds from the past were still fresh, still too raw. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I let myself fall, I would end up alone again, piecing myself back together. "I know," I whispered, though my voice wavered with doubt. The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. For the first time I felt the space between us widen, like I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. He had offered me something real, something I hadn't thought I'd ever find again. But I wasn't sure if I could take it. He inhaled deeply, his eyes dropping to the ground for a moment before looking up at me again. "If you're not ready," he said quietly, "I understand. But I need to know if there's a chance. Because if there isn't, I don't think I can keep doing this." My chest tightened at his words. He was giving me an out, offering me a way to step back without any more hurt. But deep down I knew that walking away would hurt just as much. It might even hurt more. I opened my mouth to speak, to say that I needed more time, that I didn't have all the answers, but the words wouldn't come. I stood there, frozen, unable to take the step toward him. The silence between us felt deafening, and I saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes, the realization that I wasn't giving him what he needed. He nodded slowly, his face closing off. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. Before I could say anything, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the clearing. The cold air cut through me as I watched him walk into the distance, and I felt a wave of regret wash over me. I had been too afraid to take the leap, too terrified of what it meant to let someone in. And now the chance was slipping away.
Goodbye.